American global conflict analyst, specializes in geopolitics, stateless nations, and armed guerrilla movements. Dr. Thoreau Redcrow, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, Doctor, first of all, we would like to understand the United States policies in the Middle East. Could you explain the broader strategic policies of the US in the region, and also what needs to be understood regarding America's regional policies towards the Kurds? Very shortly, please.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrating things that I'm sure many of your viewers see is how the US policy towards the Kurds can differ so greatly from month to month and from administration to administration. I think everyone recognizes that the Kurdish people are probably the best allies that the United States has in the Middle East. If you look at previous conflicts and the way that the US and Kurds have worked together in the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, in defeating ISIS in Rojava in Syria, and then the cooperation that you see in Bashur in northern Iraq. So I think one of the frustrating things is people see, well, the US and the Kurds work so well together in these forms of conflict, but why doesn't the US government support Kurds on the political arena? It seems that most of these issues seem to be that the Kurds helping the United States, but not the United States helping the Kurds politically to either gain autonomy or their rights. So that's one of the kind of broader things. One of the difficult things I think as well for international people to understand is how layered the United States government can be. So for instance, you can have very strong support for the Kurds within the US Congress, where you have 435 Congress people, and you can have strong support in the Senate, perhaps, where there's 100 senators. But ultimately, because our government is split into three parts, the executive branch, the US president, has a very large pool when it comes to US policy. So unfortunately, because of that, the US policy can shift either for the good or for the bad really quickly based on what the US president wants to do or how they're feeling at that moment. And this is some of that frustration that you've seen with the Trump administration towards the Kurds, is some of his varying statements in the past that will sort of contradict each other, or he'll say a positive thing one day and then a negative thing the next day. And that creates this sort of frustration, I think, justifiably amongst Kurds around the world, where they say, well, what is our place in this sort of relationship? And I can see why they would be skeptical, because the Kurdish people have sacrificed a lot to make the world safer, but also to make the West safer, and i.e. America safer. And so it's justifiable that they would have these concerns.
That's very clear and to the point. Thank you. Secondly, regarding the ongoing peace process in Turkey in particular, does the United States support such a process and the prospect of the peace? And considering that the US played a leading role in the international conspiracy, which ended up by jailing Kurdish leader Mr. Abdullah Öcalan, has there been any change in Washington since then toward recognizing the existence and the rights of the Kurdish people? That can be very shortly answered as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you say, the United States government has never really apologized or even acknowledged, I think, the role that they played in Abdullah Öcalan's capture. And in that, obviously, it would have been the Clinton presidency back then that would have been primarily working on that. But yeah, there's been almost nothing as far as the United States government acknowledging the role that they played, or even sort of showing remorse for that situation. Obviously, those familiar with it know that the reason why it happened ultimately was related to weapons sales to Turkey, and it was sort of part of a quid pro quo with the United States government and the Turkish government. In the present day, however, one of the disappointing things that I see with the U.S. government is also a lack of attention to the peace process going on in Turkey right now. You have this very large peace process that could have affected tens of millions of people. Normally, there would be a lot of media attention for this kind of event. This is the kind of event that could ultimately end in like Nobel Peace Prizes and sort of a large summit, maybe where the United States invites the parties to Camp David, or you have a large contingent, and the United States, unfortunately, right now is not giving the attention to it. Now, whether that is because the Turkish government has asked them to, or whether they themselves are not committed or sort of interested right now, that is yet to be seen. But I think that there should be a lot more attention. I've attended a few hearings in the Congress and Senate where they have mentioned it, and they have mentioned it hopefully saying, well, hopefully there will be a peace process, or there will be peace or reconciliation in Turkey, and that will ultimately help the United States just in the broader Middle Eastern region. If you don't have this conflict between the Turkish state and the Kurdish people, that it would sort of free up, I think, the sort of burden and increase the democracy in the region, which would have beneficial effects on all the countries throughout the Middle East. You do hear a little bit of that. Unfortunately, you don't hear enough. There should be a lot more attention given to that. It should be sort of international news and talked about frequently, and it's unfortunately not at this time.
Thank you, Doctor. My next question is also important, and it's about the Kurds level of the international relations and diplomacy. What is the current situation in US now? What kind of initiatives are taking place in the United States, and what steps are the Kurds taking in order to secure the freedom of constitutional rights in Turkey? From time to time, we see what appears to be support for the Kurds in the US, in Senator. Is this genuine support, or is it merely symbolic and it's just for appearances? For example, like Lindsey Graham's support, and it just disappeared again. So, very shortly, very briefly, what is the situation in a diplomatical way about the Kurds in US now?
Yeah, I think one of the disappointing or kind of frustrating aspects is there's a lot of support for the Kurds amongst the American population. For instance, I often tell people that if you did a poll just in the general American population on Kurds specifically, and you asked Americans, do you support Kurds, yes or no, and you compared it to almost any other nationality or ethnic group, Kurds would get probably one of the highest scores, maybe even the highest, compared to Germans, French, Russians, Chinese, any group. And so not seeing the U.S. governmental support match the support of the American population. Most of the American population support, of course, comes from U.S. military who have served oftentimes in northern Iraq or in Syria and worked alongside the Kurds. It also comes from this understanding that the Kurdish people's values, I think, more mirror what the United States would like to think of themselves as when it comes to sort of a more secular outlook and women's rights and these kind of things. So that's what's disappointing. Currently, you do have lobbying efforts taking place in DC that are fairly new. In the last 6 months, there's been various Kurdish lobbying groups that have formed up in DC. I'm part of one of those, and we have worked together with other lobbying groups, and you're starting to see like a coalition of Kurdish lobbying groups lobbying the United States government. That's new and interesting, and I think different, because unfortunately, up until recently, the Kurdish issue was not lobbied on a greater Kurdistan level. It was often just lobbied on sort of a KRG level, either from one of the two parties in the KRG, and you didn't see sort of a broader lobbying when it comes to sort of greater Kurdistan and issues in Bakur, Bashur, Rojava, Rojalat, in these areas. So I think, obviously to do that, you need a Kurdish unity effort. So there's been Kurdish unity efforts as well in the United States to bring these Kurdish groups together and bring various Kurdish factions in the United States. There's not a large Kurdish population in the US. Most of the Kurds in the US actually come from Bashur, and they came in the 1990s and early 2000s, although you have a lot of more recent arrivals from the situation in Rojava and Rojalat and many from Bakur as well. But I think Kurdish unity is important for that, and it needs to be more than superficial, because yes, there's lots of superficial statements from Trump will often say, like, I'm a big fan of the Kurds, I love the Kurds are brave, Kurds are good fighters. You hear these statements over and over. Lindsey Graham, obviously, with the Save the Kurds Act, that was very important and crucial to sort of stopping the Syrian government from continuing their invasion of Rojava. However, as you say, some of that has now stopped or lessened, and people are obviously wondering and frustrated by some of the recent statements as well, where they wonder, well, are the Kurds, being quote unquote betrayed by the United States again? Are the are the Kurds going to be abandoned after being such good allies? So all of that, is connected to this broader issue that, the four main countries, I guess, that you could say denying Kurdish autonomy, they spend a lot of money to lobby the United States government, particularly Turkey. Turkey has a very large lobbying effort in the United States, and the Kurds have never sort of tried to match that or even tried to compete against that. That's new, actually, where in the last 6 months you do see that Kurds are sort of trying to lobby and do the traditional lobbying efforts in DC to get their points heard.
Also, I would like to understand how does the Trump and his administration view the Kurds? Some of the Trump's recent statements, as you also mentioned as well, angered the many Kurds that he was also mentioning about that he's giving money and guns and always talking about this kind of conflict. So, what does the Trump expect from the Kurds, and what are his broader goals regarding the Kurdish issue? Very shortly, please.
Yeah, I think unfortunately Trump's worldview is he sees a lot of things as transactional. So it's like, what can I do for you? What can you do for me? And you see this going back in time when he's talked about the Kurdish issue in 2019, when they thought about pulling out of Serikani and Gorespi. There was this idea that that the Kurds didn't help the U.S. in World War II or whatever, famously sort of as he quipped, which actually they did, ironically, through Iraq. But he also said, that they only fight because they were paid. And again, you heard a repeat of those comments generally, where he said something to the effect of, the Kurds take, and essentially hinting at the fact that they fight for pay or fight for weapons. Obviously, nothing could be further from the truth. Many of the 13,000 shaheeds in Rojava in northeastern Syria were volunteers. They weren't paid. Many of the thousands of Kurdish guerrillas who have fought and died over the years didn't receive pay. So of course this is offensive, I think, to many Kurds around the world, because they say we're the last group that is on the take or out for pay or for money. But yeah, it's frustrating because it oftentimes seems that President Trump will repeat maybe the last thing that he's heard from an advisor or from someone else. And I think oftentimes it's whenever he has a phone call with Erdogan in Turkey. Whenever he has a phone call with Erdogan, he will oftentimes repeat the things that he hears in that discussion. So I would imagine that some of those more recent comments that angered Kurds came out of the fact that we know he did have a phone call with Erdogan in Turkey, and Erdogan, I think, repeated some of these things about maybe Kurds being on the take or essentially hinting at them being mercenaries, and then Trump repeats that in his press conference. Now, whether he actually believes that or if that's just something he's heard recently, and so he oftentimes will just repeat things that get in his head that he's heard, and then he'll move on, and then people wonder why. Well, he's not carrying out policy related to that. He's just said that. And I think it's more an issue of that. And if you did notice as well, he even says, well, the Kurds are very popular in the Congress. They're very popular in our Senate, which is true. So Trump did acknowledge the Kurds are very popular here in Washington. They're very popular with the American people and the American representatives. And he was almost lamenting at the fact that they're so popular, I have to support them even if I didn't want to, which is a positive, I think, in some ways. But I think, yes, you have, I think that, the situation in Iran, and especially in Rojava with weapons, and the idea that the Kurds were supposed to sort of carry out a rebellion on behalf of the United States, that was obviously very risky and almost insane, in the sense that it wouldn't work unless the U.S. was going to give air cover and give military arms and support, and to expect the Rojava Kurds to sort of risk, themselves and the retaliation from the Iranian government if the U.S. wasn't going to come to their aid or support them. That's obviously too risky. So, for instance, if let's say you had a rebellion right now, an uprising in Rojava, and then the U.S. signs a peace deal with Iran 2 days later, well, where would that leave all of the Kurds there who have then risen up? They would get sort of the revenge from Tehran, who would invade their areas, and especially if the U.S. wasn't going to give them a no-fly zone or air support. So I think some of that was just his general frustration with the way that the Iran war is going. I think he figured that the Iran war would be very fast and quick, and they would surrender very quickly, and that would be it. And then he could sort of use the Kurds as one of the groups that to sort of change the regime there. And when that didn't happen, I think he's now using the Kurds as sort of one of his scapegoats for his frustration on the issue and why it's not working as well as he wanted. but I wouldn't, as generally, I wouldn't worry for Kurds generally that he's going to sort of turn on Kurds or anything, because as he himself said, Kurds have a very high popularity in the United States Congress and Senate, and also they're very popular on left and the right. So the political right and the political left, for different reasons, support the Kurds in the United States. So I don't think there's any risk of that, but it is something to watch.
I would like to also talk about the peace process in Turkey. Very shortly, what is your message or call to the Turkish state regarding the concrete steps that should be taken for the peace process to move on, including freedom for Öcalan? Very shortly.
Yes, I mean, of course, I would lead with the idea that Abdullah Öcalan should be released today. He should have been released tomorrow. He should have been released 26 years ago. The idea that, or you could say not ever even arrested to begin with, but yes, I mean, the freedom of Abdullah Öcalan at this point is very important. It's necessary. There will essentially be no reconciliation or peace process or, the situation in sort of southeastern Turkey, northern Kurdistan, in this region, but I would say even greater Kurdistan, throughout all four regions, will not be able to resolve itself. That sort of Gordian knot will not be able to untangle itself until Abdullah Öcalan is released from prison. We have a lot of examples in history to prove this. I think the Turkish government and state are slowly realizing this, that they have to release him at some point. Continually, with every statement that's released, with every letter that's released, Abdullah Öcalan shows his maturity. He shows his sort of statesmanship. He shows that he is not out for revenge. He shows that he's for reconciliation, that he just wants democracy. He just wants the Kurdish people to have their language rights, their cultural rights, that he wants sort of true democracy in the Turkish Republic. And many of the things that the Turkish Republic says that they believe in, he says, okay, I believe in that too. Give us that. That's what we want. Give us the democracy that you say exists. And that's what's so frustrating, I think, is that there's a huge opportunity there to create a peace process. But if you look at the example of South Africa, for instance, Nelson Mandela would say only a free man can negotiate. In order to get a full negotiation out of Mr. Öcalan, you have to have him released so that he can negotiate and meet with the media, meet with reporters, meet with international leaders. You could have a certain house or something. In the case of Nelson Mandela, they had him in a house and people could go and visit there, and you could have visitors. You need some similar situation right now. And in the case of Mr. Ocalan, because you have to have a situation where people can visit him and he can talk to the media and he can organize this peace process. There's also a lot of things that have to happen to have a true peace process. You'd have to decide what will happen to the thousands of Kurdish guerrillas and fighters who have spent maybe decades in the mountains. There has to be a form for them to return back if they want to Turkish cities, to go back to regular life. How's that going to happen? There's a lot of things I think to consider for a peace process like this. And right now, many of the things seem to be symbolic, visits, a letter here or there during a holiday or something, but there really needs to be concrete action because another 40 years of war in this modern age of drones and more high-tech weapons and things is not going to benefit either side. And so, yeah, I think ideally the peace process will continue. I think we need a lot of international support for it. The Council of Europe needs to be key in this. They need to recognize Öcalan's right to hope. Essentially, international law says that no person can serve more than 25 years in prison. He's past that 25-year threshold. He needs to be released immediately under international law because of that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thoreau Redcrow, American global conflict analyst specialized in geopolitics and stateless nations. Thank you for accepting that interview. Thank you so much for your valuable comments.
Okay, thank you. And I hope that next time we speak, Öcalan will be free and the Kurds will be on a better path towards democracy.
Thank you so much.